back to the Unfiltered Political Lens. Tonight we're diving into one of the most explosive constitutional battles unfolding in modern American history. As Donald Trump's presidency collides with the Supreme Court, Congress, federal agencies, and the growing debate over how much power a president of the United States should actually have. Across the country, legal scholars, historians, politicians, and world leaders are watching closely because the decisions being made right now could permanently redefine presidential authority for generations to come. Donald Trump's administration has aggressively tested the limits of executive power through tariffs, immigration crackdowns, emergency declarations, federal agency control, national security decisions, and broad executive actions that supporters believe are necessary to confront modern crises. Many conservatives argue that Congress has become too divided and ineffective to respond quickly enough to the economic instability, border security problems, international conflict, and the rising competition from nations like China. Critics, however, warn that allowing the president to increasingly bypass Congress through executive authority could weaken the constitutional checks and balances that America's founders intentionally created to prevent any one branch of government from becoming too powerful. And one of the biggest constitutional battles currently unfolding centers around Trump's use of emergency economic powers to impose sweeping tariffs on foreign import. Trump argued that America's dependence on foreign manufacturing represents a national economic emergency threatening U.S. security and long-term stability. But the federal courts and the Supreme Court pushed back by ruling the existing laws did not clearly authorize presidents to impose tariffs in that manner without congressional approval. The ruling became a defining constitutional moment because it signaled that even the presidential emergency powers may have legal boundaries that cannot simply be expanded by executive interpretation alone. Despite those setbacks, Trump's administration reportedly searched for alternative legal methods to continue portions of its trade agenda using different federal authority and trade laws. This reflects a larger trend in the modern American politics where presidents increasingly rely on executive agencies, emergency declarations, and administrative powers to bypass the congressional deadlock and move policy forward independently. Some of the analysts now believe that the United States may be entering a completely new constitutional era where the true limits of presidential power are no longer being decided primarily through Congress, but instead through the Supreme Court ruling and executive branch confrontation. And another massive issue involves Trump's push for greater presidential authority over independent federal agencies such as the Federal Reserve and regulatory that were historically designed to remain partially insulated from direct political pressure. For decades, lawmakers intentionally structured these agencies to operate with a level of independence because they feared presidents could otherwise manipulate interest rates, financial policy, or federal regulations for political advantages during elections or economic crises. If the Supreme Court ultimately decides, with Trump in pending cases involving presidential firing powers and agencies' authority, future presidents could gain unprecedented influence over the institutions that have historically operated outside of the White House control. The consequences of the rulings could dramatically reshape the structure of the federal government and the American economy itself. Greater presidential authority over the agencies like the Federal Reserve could potentially increase political influence over inflation policy, interest rates, banking regulations, and long-term economic decisions, while also allowing future administrations to remove agency officials far more aggressively than before. Supporters believe, though, this would restore democratic accountability because the presidents are directly elected by the voters, while the critics warn it could politicize the institutions that were intentionally designed to remain independent for partisan political influence. And then there's immigration, which has also become one of the central backgrounds in the larger fight over executive authority and judicial oversight. The Trump administration has argued that federal courts should have much less power to interfere with the president's immigration decisions involving deportation authority, asylum restrictions, border enforcement operations, and temporary protected status programs for the migrant. Now, if courts accept those arguments, future presidents from either political party could inherit dramatically expanded immigration powers with fewer constitutional restraints and reduced judicial oversight over the executive enforcement action. And the broader constitutional concerns extends far beyond just Donald Trump himself, because throughout American history, executive powers rarely shrink once they expand. Presidents have reportedly gained new authority during wars, terrorist threats, national emergencies, economic collapses, and international conflict. And those powers were often inherited by the future administrations, regardless of their political affiliation. That means that the authority strengthened under Trump today could eventually be used for future Republican and Democratic presidents alike for decades to come, making these legal battles far more important than one presidency alone. That these constitutional battles are exposing how much of the influence on elected bureaucracies and federal agencies and the lower courts have accumulated over the past several decades. From their perspective, strengthening executive authority restores the power back to the elected leadership directly accountable to the American voters, instead of allowing the permanent government institutions to obstruct the presidential agendas through endless legal challenges and administrative resistance. Critics, however, warn that the concentrating too much of the authority inside of the executive branch will also risk weakening the constitutional safeguards that were specifically designed to prevent excessive centralized power in our federal government. The Supreme Court now sits directly at the center of this historical constitutional fight and may ultimately determine the future limits of presidential power in the modern era. The court's upcoming rulings involving tariffs, immigration authority, executive orders, federal agencies, and the emergency powers could shape how aggressively the future presidents are able to govern without congressional approval or judicial interference. Some legal scholars believe these decisions may eventually become as historically significant as landmark Supreme Court rulings that had previously reshaped civil rights, federal authority, and constitutional interpretations throughout American history. The public's trust in American institutions is also becoming an increasingly serious issue as the tensions grow between the White House, Congress, federal courts, and independent agencies. Some analysts warn that if Americans begin viewing Supreme Court rulings as purely political or operational, depending on party loyalty, long-term confidence in the constitutional system itself could weaken significantly over time. Others argue that the judiciary may be one of the final institutional barriers capable of preserving constitutional boundaries during a period of rapidly expanding executive power and a growing political polarization across the country. What makes this moment so historic is that all of these constitutional battles are happening simultaneously during a period of global instability, economic uncertainty, with immigration disputes and rising geopolitical tensions involving nations like China, Russia, and Iran, trade wars, emergency powers, border security debates, as well as Supreme Court confrontations and questions surrounding the future limits of presidential authority are all colliding into one defining test for the American presidency itself. The outcomes of these legal political battles may not only define Donald Trump's presidency, but it could permanently reshape how future presidents govern in the United States for generations to come. I want to thank you for tuning in to another Unfiltered Political Lens episode. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more political analysis, constitutional discussions, world news, updates, and breaking developments shaping the future of American and global politics. Thank you again for watching. Stay informed, stay aware, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.